Heinrich Schenker was born in what is now Western Ukraine, and had a long career as a polymath in Vienna, where he also got a law degree in addition to his musical activities. One of these was as a composer. Apparently Brahms thought highly of his work, but he was also a pianist. He conducted, and he pioneered the use of autographed manuscripts when making editions of famous pieces. He also spent a lot of time thinking about musical structure and tonal analysis. His magnum opus was the culmination of a lifetime of analysis. We'll get to you in a minute. Schenker's main contribution to music was a set of terms, techniques, principles, and methods known collectively as Schenkerian analysis. He hated the chord and phrase-centric approach of his day. He hated any analysis that focused only on the surface level of the music. Schenker's theories are about uncovering the counterpoint that governs the structure of a piece. What are the most important parts of a composition, and how does voice leading work across the whole thing? What, in essence, was the underlying structure of tonal music, and why did it come about? I'm the Classical Nerd, and today we're examining some of Schenker's main ideas, some of the most important bits of terminology, and the notation that he invented. We'll also be talking about some of its drawbacks, the way its precepts mesh with Schenker's political ideas, and how contemporary music theory might build a healthy relationship to the work and the insights of someone who, turns out, is kind of an unsavory dude. Spoiler alert. Schenkerian analysis isn't one thing. It's more like a method. Schenker wrote a lot, and he left us with something more like a set of tools for reading a piece. More so than other systems, Schenkerian analysis is something of an interpretive language. Two Schenkerians may come up with two valid readings of the same piece, both equally faithful to Schenker's ideas. It really just depends on what each analyst sees as structurally important. Schenker's theories are many things, but the biggest of them is that there's a hierarchy of musical levels. There is the foreground, which is what you actually hear, one or more middle ground levels where structurally unimportant notes are slowly chiseled away, and finally there is the background, which is the core voice-leading superstructure of a piece. Alan Fort pointed out that Schenker's main achievement as a theorist was not what he discovered in the deep background, but rather the fact that there were these structural layers at all. And this is the part of the theory that is the most applicable beyond the limited corpus of music that he analyzed. Schenker believed that all the masterworks, the works of the dozen-odd guys he saw as the geniuses, are, on their deepest structural level, the exact same thing. The running joke in theory circles is that, according to Schenker, all music can be reduced to three blind mice. To him, works of genius unfolded the same underlying background structure, where a bass moves 1-5-1 and the upper line descends from scale degree 3 or scale degree 5. Schenkerians are divided as to whether you can start such a line all the way up from scale degree 1. Ethan Hine described it this way. To Schenker, not only are cadences very important in this music, but at the deepest level, they are the only things happening in the music. All the complexity of a Beethoven or Brahms symphony is just surface decoration for big, slow cadences. Schenkerian analysis works by assuming that each piece is a big, perfect, authentic cadence, moving through an area defined by the tonic, something that he called tonal space. This has its roots in the harmonic series, which Schenker called the chord of nature. To him, the geniuses innately understood these structures, which is why they were the geniuses and you're not. Everything else is just a composing out from this structure, be it on a middle ground layer or ultimately the foreground of a piece. Starting on the third or fifth of the chord of nature, set up a structural descent to the nearest available tonic. In the Schenker verse, background voice leading is structural. It's supported harmonically in the bass. His justification went something like this. All music is sound. Sound and art emerge from nature. Therefore, music should justify itself using something from the natural world, and pure music should contain nothing outside of itself. The only acoustic phenomenon suitable here is the harmonic series, the sonic equivalent of a prism where one sound contains many. He doesn't dwell on the harmonic series as a naturalistic explanation, but it is there in his writings. The major triad is embedded in these overtones, as is the very concept of counterpoint. Melodies are just embellishments of basic contrapuntal lines that exist in the middle ground. Therefore, from acoustics and nature, Schenker could justify contrapuntal tonal music as pure music. Anything less wasn't music at all. Dissonance can never be part of a chord. It's only ever in passing, and can only exist as a function of elaboration. Since the major triad is inherent in the natural world, all music was just an elaboration of a fundamental harmonic reality. So his motto was, always the same, but never in the same way. But it was in Latin, because of course it was. Schenker's magnum opus was De freie Satz, usually translated as free composition on account of Satz not having a direct correlation in English. Usually when you see Satz used musically, it refers to movements of a larger work. Outside of music, it usually refers to sentences, but it has a host of other meanings. I use the German because I don't like the idea of this getting so mangled in translation. He does use the term free to contrast with strict species counterpoint, which got a lot of the rules right, but was too focused on that surface level, note-to-note stuff. He didn't feel like strict composition saw the bigger background picture. Now, Schenkerians will be the first to tell you not to start with this book. It was published after his death, and so he didn't have the time to make it accessible or readable. Even in this edition, there's a whole separate volume just for his hundreds of musical examples, which is just super annoying when you're trying to do research for a YouTube video. Schenker's view in that there are these layers of structure is a usual framework, even if you're not sold on the whole rest of it. It's like parallel fifths. They're rare in tonal music because they call attention to themselves, and that got distilled into a blanket prohibition. I have a whole video on that. Famously, Brahms collected examples of parallel fifths in a volume that was edited and published by Heinrich Schenker. To Schenker, you could pull a parallelism off if you were a genius, aware of the underlying structure. Analysts got caught up in the chord-by-chord view, so they saw all parallelism as equally bad. But to Schenker, the presence of something unusual on the surface level, including parallel fifths or octaves, could be explained as the unfolding of a deeper structure, something in the background or in the middle ground. It's how he explains all unusual chords, contrapuntal motion on different layers that happen to combine on the surface and make some odd-sounding sonorities sometimes, but they're structurally important, and so they still work. To that end, he's also a seventh chord truther. Because in the Schenker verse, seventh chords don't exist. They can't exist. It's logically consistent. The only sonority that can be composed out is the consonant triad. The seventh's a dissonance. It started life in Western music as a result of passing motion. Other theorists, again, they emphasize the verticals. They turned common voice leading into a chord in and of itself, and Schenker objected to this practice. Schenkerian terms are often presented in their original German. This English translation did not appear until 1979. That's almost 45 years for the terminology to solidify in the original language after Schenker's death, and so I think that makes it worth knowing. Plus, some of these terms present problems in translation. Depending on the English context, you might have to translate the same German word 2 or even 3 different ways, and obviously that does not do the ideas any favors. One of Schenker's central ideas was Auskomponierung, literally translated as composing out, but perhaps better understood as prolongation or elaboration. It's a blanket term for a host of different techniques where chords, consonant sonorities, are converted into a succession of individual tones. A chord can be expanded and elaborated upon, even in sections where the chord itself is not sounding. To make an analogy with traditional tonal analysis, you might have a motion from 1 to 1/6 via 5/4/3. We could say that this is expanding 1 even when we're hearing a dominant seventh in inversion. This is a foreground version of that same principle. What Schenker is talking about is just doing this on a much, much larger scale. The deep background I showed earlier is called the Orsatz. It's the combination of a bass arpeggiation, called the Bassbrechung, and the descending structural voice leading line, called the Urlinie. Intermediate key areas would have to divide the fifth, something Schenker called the Oberquintteiler, or upper fifth divider, which had implications for the form of the piece. Schenker's writings on rhythm and form are typically pretty limited, and so they serve as a perfect launch pad for Schenkerians who were looking to expand the theory. Schenker was interested in how composers used repetition to give meaning and structure to pieces. But it's not the kind of repetition that you're probably thinking about. He's more interested in middle ground repetition, in shedding layers of the foreground to reveal similar harmonic structures between different sections of a score. Let's take Mozart's celebrated D minor fantasy. The opening has an underlying structure that begins on F and rises to A before winding down to C sharp. The point is that if we're just interested in the surface level, we get caught up in the chord structures, we're not going to be paying attention to music's linear dimension. By ignoring traditional chordal analysis, for the most part, Schenker gives us a powerful analytical tool for understanding how a piece of music that may sound so discombobulated on the surface, Mozart's fantasy for one, hold together so well. Implicit here is that whether we're aware of these underlying middle ground and background connections or not, they're still there, and they help us parse what's happening because these superstructures assure unity and clarity and directionality. Music to Schenker was all about its endings, where the piece in question would ultimately go. Schenkerian analysis is rooted in counterpoint, and its application enables us to look at how triads play themselves out over extended periods of time. The most basic sense of prolongation is what we call second species counterpoint, two notes against one note. Schenker expanded this to linear progressions, or Auskomponiierungszug, that could unfold any interval found in the triad. If a progression went through the tonal space of a third, it was a third progression. If it goes through a fifth, it is a fifth progression. This is the origin of the octave progression controversy. For many Schenkerians, there are just too many unsupported notes in this kind of progression for all of the notes to be structurally important. Register, therefore, is especially important in the Schenker verse. If a line was set up in a certain register, it was absolutely obligated to return to that same register to conclude. Schenker noticed that triadic harmony works even when we don't hear that chord as a block chord. So if the notes of the chord are spread out in a melody, we hear it as a form of composing out an underlying harmony. The German word he uses for structurally important harmonies is Stufe, which refers to a step or a level, which I think can confuse English speakers because we're used to hearing the word step as the distance between two notes in a scale. Schenker is thinking a bit differently. He thinks of triads as harmonic objects. Like almost every tonal theorist, the tonic and dominant were the two most important of the Stufen, that's the plural form, with the others acting in various intermediate roles. Now, Schenker had ultra-conservative tastes, which we'll get to in due time. He rejected every composer after Brahms, and also some pretty fundamental ideas, such as pieces can modulate. Schenker didn't believe in that. To be fair, he lived in a time when theory was polluted with, let's call them unusual concepts, and Schenker was more than willing to call these people out. He was a critic of the so-called undertone series as an explanation of the minor triad. He was even critical of the very concept of the key itself. In this translation, at least, key always has scare quotes around it. Conventional wisdom was that when a piece of music modulates, it changes key. For Schenker, though, if you got to the background structure, a move to 5 or 3 or anywhere else was just temporary. Whatever happened in that key area was just elaborating a temporary Stufe that has a subordinate role to the tonic no matter how long you stay there. Hence, Schenkerian theory has a really hard time explaining pieces that end in a different key than the one in which they began. It quite literally breaks the theory. In such cases, Schenkerians would be forced to argue that such pieces might sound like they start in one key but actually start in a different key, or they end somewhere where it doesn't sound like they end. It just is a mess. Schenker was ahead of his time when it came to editing editions. He was one of the first to see original manuscripts as a primary source, and he believed that the sketches left behind by all these great geniuses constituted evidence that they were thinking about structural voice leading, and ultimately that they were thinking about the ersatz itself. He called himself the founder of the autograph studying field, which went along with his theories of musical coherence. Explicit in his writing is that there is a correct way to perform and a correct way to hear, and they're all connected to the fundamental structure. To the point that, to him, just The act of reading an autographed manuscript was impossible unless you came to it with the right knowledge, unless you were really prepared for it. And it gets really metaphysical. The fundamental structure becomes a meeting point of past, present, and future. For some time, Schenker even believed that one could deduce the proper dynamic level of any phrase from what it articulated within the structure. Schenker believed that a good performance of a piece was only possible if the performer was aware of the connections between foreground, middle ground, and background layers. The idea is that you have to have a sense of what's structurally important in order to know what you should emphasize or de-emphasize in a good performance, which is logically sound. This analysis informed his choice of fingering when editing pieces. If he believed that if two motifs right next to one another on the surface were in fact not related on some deeper structural level, he would use fingering to force the player to play those two things separately, even if they were under the same slur in the original autograph. A performance was tasteless, however, if it focused only on the Erlinie. Rather, he believed a good performance had to focus on its diminutions in the middle ground. Schenker saw the Erlinie on the largest level, yes, but also mirrored in the middle ground, a form of compositional self-similarity. Repetition in voice-leading structures, not just a foreground copy-paste job. Music, Schenker wrote, was destined to reach its culmination in the likeness of itself. In this he referred to his concept of diminution. In most theory circles, diminution is when something comes back, but with shorter note values. Now, Schenker's using the term as a catch-all term for any type of embellishment. In his mind, it's like a structural ornamentation, when what happens in the background has analogs on all intermediate layers. All foreground, he wrote, is diminution. The principle of diminution means that Schenkerian analysis works on the largest level of a piece, but you can also analyze smaller snippets with the same methodology. A phrase of a piece should have the same characteristics as the whole. In fact, this is the literal textbook way in which Schenkerian analysis is taught. Now, hey, what do all these symbols mean? Schenker's graphs are supposed to show the most important notes in a piece. The deeper towards the background that you go, the more notes you lose. Huge pieces end up mashed into a single system. This Schenkerian innovation is a voice-leading graph, or Linientafel, intended to succinctly show the progression of important large-scale structures through a piece. Schenkerian graphs use Western notation in unconventional ways. Note values and stems show hierarchies and connections at different levels, rather than the amount of time that the notes take. Open note heads show the most important structural notes, whereas filled-in note heads are less important. Stems are often added at varying lengths to indicate different levels of structural significance. That one is a post-Schenker innovation that really caught on. Parenthetical notes are implied, but not actually present. Beams, slurs, and arrows are all used to group notes together and show that multiple notes are part of the same structure. Dashed slurs show connections across larger time spans. Most of the filled-in note heads will have slurs to show connections. In this case, Schenker is highlighting how a middle ground linear progression can echo the larger structure. The beamed half notes show a fifth progression or linear that gets interrupted at the dominant, and there's also a 5-4-3-2-1 motion in a diminution of this fifth progression, shown in black note heads under a slur. The dashed slur shows that, even when we're hearing all these intermediate notes, the structure is still on 1 in the bass, supporting scale degree 5 in this particular register. Likewise, when the bass reaches scale degree 5 for the first time, it's not a structural 5. Here the Erlinie and the Bassbrechung are imitated on other structural levels. This gets very complicated very fast. Ideally, these analyses show the background as well as at least one middle ground layer. In this Beethoven analysis, Schenker does just that. You see how the slurs from the background become dashed slurs in the middle ground to show a long-range connection. The graphs illuminate how, in unique ways, each piece of tonal music expands upon the same underlying structure, the Erlinie. But then you'll see Schenkerian diagrams that have notes that go above the Erlinie. Schenkerians have all sorts of words to describe situations where the notes that seem structurally important are in places where they shouldn't be, either in time or in register. These are superpositions, or maybe they're Übergreifen, or perhaps it might be a registral shift or a coupling, to different categories for when the whole or linear changes octave. If the note just isn't there, then maybe it's just implied via substitution. If a note of the Erlinie shows up but it's unsupported in the Bassbrechung, that's just a displacement. If the ersatz gets cut off before being completed, that's just an interruption leading to two branches of the ersatz divided by what Schenker called a Tyler, or divider. Whenever you get that word, it's important to Schenker's ideas of form. Because Schenker didn't take things like repetition or how long a section of music lasts into account, Alan Cadwallader and David Gagne admit that, in many cases, Schenker's discussion of form is more apt for a discussion of structure, which is a little bit different. Schenker insisted that his graphs were not reductions, but part of the composition itself. And he believed that the graphs did a better job of explaining his theories than words did. Which, by the way, fact check, absolutely true. Without the musical supplements, the freie Satz is not just boring, it is literally unreadable. Other than some of these basic principles, though, Schenkerian notation as a form of reduction is not standardized. Not even in Schenker's own analyses. The notation began as a way to show Schenkerian principles, sure, but that's like saying that Cyrillic is only good for writing Old Church Slavonic. If you think that the ability to strip away the foreground is meaningful, and aren't all that concerned with standardizing what certain types of beams and note heads and slurs mean, I think Schenkerian graphs are not only useful as illustrations in other theoretical contexts, but maybe the most useful thing that Schenker ever gave us. In David Neumeyer and Susan Tepping's Guide to Schenkerian Analysis, they use it to look at Debussy's The Sunken Cathedral and Prelude to the Afternoon of a Faun. The twin notions of structural layers and this notation system are the two most useful and broadly applicable things that Schenker gave us. It is the theory at its most flexible. Beyond that, when Schenker gets into specifics, things get trickier, because like any theory, it has its limitations. As Oswald Jonas put it in his introduction to Schenker, the theory is not an intellectually manufactured system made to fit certain initial assumptions, but is derived rather from an intimate knowledge of the masterworks. And Schenker channeled Kant in saying that there is no danger of my theory being refuted, only of being misunderstood. From the jump, Schenker presents a collection of ideas that are subjective and narrow, as though they are objective and broad. Instead of saying, hey, here's a way to understand tonal music in the German tradition, he says, whatever fits my theory is music. Whatever doesn't fit isn't music. Which is a little bit drastic. He liked to claim that the geniuses were instinctively aware of what they were doing, but his writings give me a sense that he didn't have much of an appreciation for the hard work and the craft that goes into composition. When he talks about the great masters as free from being boxed in by the rules of strict counterpoint, he's not really thinking like a composer, even though he was one for a time. One of the limitations here are precisely the list of prolongation techniques I mentioned in the previous section. To the Schenkerian, these are essential techniques. To the skeptic, it looks like the theory has a dozen built-in terms to describe situations where the music isn't a good fit for the theory, where every possible, conceivable objection and loophole situation is plugged up with a yes, but. That has a fancy, fun German name half the time. Having so many exceptions is necessary when the core of the theory is so simple. Perhaps too simple. Of course, you have to build in explanations and build in exceptions if, like Schenker, you're after a theory that's non-falsifiable. In tonal music, it's inevitable. You can find the requisite scale degrees to strip a piece down to an ersatz. Of course, the third of the tonic chord is going to be present somewhere near the beginning of a tonal piece. It's basically inevitable. The diatonic scale only has 7 notes after all. This reduction of the Star-Spangled Banner from the Neumeyer Tepping book is a perfect illustration of how Schenker's insistence on structure can be at odds with the listening experience. You mean to tell me that the scale degree 3 found on the upbeat of measure 2 is more important than all the other times scale degree 3 shows up? Schenkerian theory forces this to be a note of deep structural importance, and I've been to enough baseball games to know otherwise. Schenker pointed out repetition in the form of structural self-similarity, as we've previously discussed. But when dealing with repetition on the surface, things get a little bit trickier. The late great Marty Boykin, in the 3rd chapter of his book Silence in Slow Time, points out, with great reverence for Schenker's work I might add, that the theory was concerned with temporality but not rhythm. Everything flows from a sonority, which is realized in time as the ersatz. But to Boykin, this didn't leave enough room for repetition as a device to increase musical coherence. In other words, the foreground is still pretty darn important. He cites the second song of Schumann's Dichterliebe. If the music from measures 5 through 8 is essentially the same as the music in measures 13 through 17, how could it be that one was more important than the other in terms of elaborating the ersatz? The difference between these passages are surface-level things, the placement of certain chords on certain accented spots. These surface-level components are not supposed to affect the background structure. And yet, the Schenkerian has to hear the latter as more important because of where it comes in the piece. To Boykin, the foreground is not always a clear composing out of the background, because that limits the role of rhythm and the agency of the composer to work with or against the long-term voice leading. The ersatz and its elaborations are narrative strategies, something like archetypes of tonal music, not ones that could or even should be slavishly followed. Boykin has a nuanced critique. Others are far more blunt. In the conclusion of his way too long book, Questioning Schenkerism, Bengt Edlund writes that, quote, Schenker's simple theory is largely based on readings that by force of various transformation tools resolutely iron out, shave away overthrowing evidence. The simplicity of the theory is only apparent. The tonal backgrounds arrived at are simple, to be sure, but the theory itself lugs around with quite a few assumptions and postulates. Due to these additional entities, the theory in effect becomes too simplistic to do justice to the actual and often complex musical processes within the masterworks that are subjected to study. I feel like there's always been a strain of neo-Gnosticism within the Schenkerverse, the idea of secret knowledge hidden from the common people. In their introduction to Schenkerian analysis of tonal music, Cadwallader and Gagne don't get to the main idea of this superstructure until around page 114, which is over halfway through the first part of this textbook, which covers Schenker's basic principles. Pedagogically, I get that they're trying to structure the book to mirror Schenker's gradual discovery of his ideas. But the lack of upfront information about what Schenker actually believed, the true unadulterated heart of his theory, comes off like they're trying to bury the lead here. I kind of wonder if they thought that if the student were to learn about the ersatz up front, the student would reject all Schenkerian analysis for being too reductive. Sort of like how the Scientologists don't tell you about Xenu until you've already donated your whole net worth. In the essay collection Aspects of Schenkerian Theory, it's a fun cover I know, Saul Novak ended his contribution, which is on the applicability of the theory to pre-Baroque music, with the following statement. We have no other recourse for understanding the music of the past but to rely on what Schenker has taught us. Its validity is unquestionable, its limitations none. Really? No limitations? At all? I pull this quote because I think it encapsulates an ideological commitment seen in some Schenkerians, one in which Schenker's shortcomings are explained away or overlooked. It's a view that treats Schenker as a prophet of music. And having read a lot of what Schenker had to say, I do not think we need to be treating this guy so kindly. Schenker did not think of his theory as one of music, but one of genius. There was a huge gulf between the genius and the mediocre composer. These geniuses based their compositions on background transformations, not surface-level motives. The ultimate secrets of composition, the mark of true genius, Schenker wrote, would be forever inaccessible. Only the genius is connected with God, he wrote, not the people. The freedom to think is reserved for the geniuses. And compared to Beethoven, you're nothing. You're less than nothing. Like, this whole passage just smacks of a guy who believed that social inequality was a good thing because he did. True freedom was only accessible to the genius. It's not the antithesis of constraints, what the word freedom usually means. Oh my gosh, this guy and Peter Thiel will get along so well. Schenker's theory stretched from Bach to Brahms. He was, I'd say, kind of patronizing to composers before Bach, even some incredible masters like Palestrina, because the modal system of that era was just less evolved. Palestrina was a musical Cro-Magnon, just a product of his time, when music hadn't yet reached its golden age. On the other hand, he felt that modernism, and again, This Is Anybody After Brahms was not music at all. For all his talk about genius, he believed that music history had produced only a dozen. In the freie Satz, Schenker assembled hundreds of examples. The overwhelming majority are from J.S. and C.B.E. Bach's, Beethoven, Brahms, Chopin, Handel, Haydn, Mendelssohn, Mozart, Domenico Scarlatti, Schubert, and Schumann. He'll throw in a Josquin or a Hugo Wolf occasionally, but those are outlying examples used to prove very specific points. 99% of the examples are going to 1% of the composers. These dozen composers were his geniuses, who understood all levels of a piece and could improvise a unique composing out on the spot. Past Brahms, composers didn't know how to compose out anymore, and that was music's downfall. He blamed Wagner for destroying the link between the Erlinie and the great geniuses, and compared him to Karl Marx. As you might imagine, dude was not a fan of Marx. Schenker was fiercely anti-democratic, and he especially hated the French. And he found that the United States was not a proper country because we have never had a monarch. At least not yet, as of this recording. Unless you think these entirely separate from his musical thought, he goes out of his way to take a dig at mongrel songs of Venetian gondoliers while introducing a Mendelssohn analysis. Scarlatti was a genius, but is not above backhanded compliments. 4 months after Hitler became the German Chancellor, Schenker wrote a letter to his pupil, Johann Felix Eberhard von Kuba, saying that he wished for a Hitler of music who would come in and destroy musical Marxism. More on this comment later, and no, it doesn't get all that much better with context. Latter-day Schenkerians usually try to acknowledge but downplay Schenker's views. He was a product of his time, they'll say, or they'll create hypothetical scenarios to make Schenker look better. In one of the many prefaces and introductions to this English translation of the freie Satz, Alan Ford confidently declared that almost none of the material, and here he means Schenker's political rants, bears substantive relation to the musical concepts that he developed. And he goes on to assert the total speculation that Schenker's political views would certainly have changed radically had he lived to witness the 1938 Anschluss of Austria and its aftermath. Bold of him to be putting words in Schenker's mouth like that. Yeah, maybe that would have happened, I don't know, but Fort certainly did not know either. I'm not trying to pick on Fort here, it's just that his argument is pretty typical. There's an admission of problematic political takes, and then both a desire to downplay them and an argument about how you can separate the theory from the man. To which I say, have you people even read Schenker? Ruth is currently trying to gnaw on one of the Schenker books. Ruth, you can't do that. I borrowed this from the library. For this video, I read through Schenker's one-man periodical, Der Tonwille. And when you do that, it becomes pretty clear that Schenker viewed his monarchic, reactionary, extremely pro-German politics and his analysis as inseparable. This volume is shot through with rhetoric that's so over the top that it would be funny if it wasn't so hateful. Schenker's analysis, his belief in what made for great music, and his far-right politics are so enmeshed, they're so thoroughly intertwined that any Schenkerian who feels that they can completely separate them is just not being honest. The inferiority of French and Italian and Turkish and American and Japanese musics was a reflection of the inferiority of all those cultures and all those peoples. I'm sorry, your theory is gonna be missing something if you're so racist against the French that you can't accept them as having musical literacy. Saying that Schenker was a product of his time is what they call a thought-terminating cliché. It's as true of Schenker as it's true of anybody, but that cliché assumes that the question is about whether he was bigoted, when the question is really about how much Schenker's theory was impacted by his bigotry, and what knock-on effects that may have in present-day theory. If you end with the whole product of his time line, you avoid contemplating these more advanced questions. Schenker's theories came to America via Hans Weisse. He came over from Vienna in 1931 and began teaching at Mannes in New York City, which became an epicenter of Schenkerian thought through his students, and by attracting like-minded Schenkerians over from Europe. This group included Ernst Oster and Oswald Jonas, who became key figures in the published material we have on Schenker in English. Oster even got most of Schenker's unpublished papers. Jeanette Schenker was afraid the Nazis would burn it all, and she met her end in Theresienstadt just a few months before the end of the Second World War. In the many years between the arrival of Schenkerian thought on these shores and the beginnings of translations and publications, Schenkerian analysis was treated, I know I've used this word earlier, Gnostically. In the truest sense of the word, it was hidden and secretive knowledge. In order to access it, you had to seek out a pupil or a grand pupil of the man himself. And the course of study would be about learning to make analytical graphs. Only once the student was fully prepared, fully immersed, could they then go on to read Schenker. That's how Fort describes the situation, at least. Things have obviously gotten a lot better since then, but that air of hidden truths guarded by a close circle of acolytes and their disciples hung around basically until Schenker's work started coming out in English and thus being more broadly available for the average student. The larger political trends of the time, especially with the Nazis' rise to power, stopped Schenkerian theory in its tracks over in Europe. And that's how it found a home in the United States as music theory and analysis took root in academic institutions. It's somewhat odd because this was the era when composers were moving further and further away from tonality. So what gives? Was there a real break within the music academic institutions? To an extent, but I would say that despite the theory's laser-like focus on tonality, it does have a breadth. It has a seemingly comprehensive explanatory power, and it focuses on deep structures and subliminal coherence. It was the perfect ideological fit, even in music departments where the composers were all doing serialism. Schenker's ideas made their way into the music of Milton Babbitt, who was first introduced to Schenkerian concepts the year that Schenker died. At the risk of making broad generalizations, American serialism was more syncretic than its European counterpart, more open to thinking of structure in both organic and hierarchical ways. Schenkerian theory promised coherence and unity in a piece of music based around an assumption about background structure, from which everything supposedly spins out. Babbitt replaced the ersatz with a tone row. To him, the structure of a piece's set was the equivalent to Schenker's ersatz. It was realized differently, but it was all there in foreground, middle ground, and background. Row structure could govern and unify an entire composition. Charles Warren, who expanded upon Babbitt's serial ideas to form multi-layered nested serial structures, inherited a Schenkerian idea. I couldn't find any evidence of a direct link between Warren's fractalization and Schenkerian theory when I was doing my Warren video, but I think there's a strong case to be made that there is a link there, and that link came through Babbitt. Schenker was a Jew who died in 1935 in a Europe soon to be engulfed in World War II. And indeed, Schenker's Jewish provenance has led to some dishonest arguments over the years, arguments which seek to label Schenker's critics as anti-Semitic, which is ridiculous. Schenker had his own contradictions, but his Jewishness is largely irrelevant, to the point that I've been able to discuss his theory and criticisms of it without mentioning it up until now, and we're getting close to the end here. It's just been a non-factor aside from the inherent irony. Schenker had a pretty narrow definition of what proper music was, and it was centered around the supremacy of the Germanic tradition. Now, I do want to clarify that somebody pre-World War II believing in Germanic cultural supremacy was not the same thing as being a Nazi. Arnold Schoenberg believed that his technique of organizing atonal music would assure the supremacy of German music for the next 100 years, and he was also run out of the continent for being Jewish. That said, there is a reason that the Nazis appropriated the ideas of German cultural supremacy and anti-Semitism, because these concepts already existed in the culture, although one's belief in the former does not indicate belief in the latter. So when Schenker limited the corpus of music subject to his analysis, and did so on the basis of what he believed to be the only body of work worth studying, it is unfair to say that he did this from some kind of proto-Nazi position. He would, at certain points, express a strong distaste for Nazi ideology. But it wasn't because they were racist and hyper-nationalist. To Schenker, it was more like they just weren't doing the racism and the hyper-nationalism correctly. like their bigotry was just misplaced or something. Did he believe, as some anti-Schenkerians claim today, that the hierarchical relationships of his theory were a reflection of what he believed to be a hierarchy of human races and ethnicities? I get the impulse to say that, I really do, but I'm also really skeptical that Schenker believed it. I've not been able to track down a primary source for that claim and Schenker's own writing. This analogy between structural layers and colonialism plays a supporting role in the anti-Schenker arguments of Philip Ewell, whose 2019 paper Music Theory and the White Racial Frame kicked off as much of a firestorm as there can be in music theory academia. That is a whole different can of worms, and I'm not about to become one of those drama YouTubers recounting the whole he said of it. Because yeah, it's mostly due to argue on the internet. I searched that Schenker quote about Hitler that Ewell used in his article, the one I alluded to earlier in this video, because I wanted to see it in full context. The pro-Schenker argument here is to point out that Schenker said disparaging things about Nazis at other points, and secondly that von Kübel was a sympathizer, so the argument goes that Schenker was trying to reach him in a language that he would understand. And I kind of find it hard to believe that a true believer Nazi would be an unswerving champion of Schenker's ideas, but this is why I wanted to see the full exchange between these two. On May 6, 1933, Schenker concluded a letter to von Kübel by writing, "In a world that has not yet understood the smallest of tones, yet dares to politicize it, there is no longer any place for musicians who deny music's calling in the realm of politics. And yet, as all previous experiments have hitherto proved utterly futile, so too will the most recent experiment prove futile. In spite of all the political murmurings, music will finally hold its own with its special qualities." Von Kübel responded 5 days later, "The things that are happening in Germany are in essence what you have so often extolled. Do not let the revolutionary neighbor noises deceive you of the genius conceived linear here. Germany is conceiving the world anew." Schenker, in his reply 3 days after that, referred to the whole page of von Kübel's letter as beautiful. They both mentioned things in a roundabout way before here Schenker brings up Hitler of his own accord. Hitler's historical service of having got rid of Marxism is something that posterity, including the French, English, and all those who have profited from transgressing against Germany, will celebrate with no less gratitude than the great deeds of the greatest Germans. If only the man were born to music who would similarly get rid of the musical Marxists. That would require that the masses were more in touch with our intrinsically eccentric art, which is something that, however, is and must remain a contradiction in terms. Art and the masses have never belonged together, and never will belong together. And where would one find the huge numbers of musical brown shirts that would be needed to hunt down the musical Marxists? Schenker's diary entries show his disdain for Hitler's followers, which tracks with the ways in which the Nazi regime took hold of the levers of power and used them to turn their anti-Semitic rhetoric into a horrible reality. Yet Schenker was perfectly willing to see Hitler as a force for good in history. The passage of the Enabling Act, less than 2 months before this exchange happened, cracked down on the communists and turned Hitler into a dictator in one fell swoop. Schenker's hatred for Marx and his contempt for democracy combined here. He was perfectly willing to overlook a lot of terrible things. He may not have liked the Nazis, especially what they ended up trying to do, but he didn't care for what he called human rights either. Hello, Ruth. You want attention, don't you? I do these at 1 a.m., and she still begs for attention. To sum up, there are several key points in Schenkerian analysis that are helpful to lots of theorists looking at lots of different kinds of music. The idea that long-range voice leading can determine a form and shape a piece's coherence. The idea that voice leading patterns can iterate themselves across structural levels. And the frankly beautiful notational shorthand he devised to show these connections are some of the most useful concepts in the analyst's and even composer's toolbox. But they are not Schenker's only tools. Concepts like the ersatz are not broadly applicable, and his reasoning for limiting his corpus to 10 Germans, a Pole who lived in France, an Italian who lived in Spain, and, this is true, a single Smetana piece, flows directly out of his prejudices. That these ideas all deeply intersect should give us pause. Aside from the content of the theory, a significant concern remains the prevalence of Schenker in graduate music theory education, especially here in the United States, a problem independent of the value system of the man who originated it, because education in music theory ought to be an education in music theories, plural. Schenker disseminated his ideas about the only music he thought to be worthwhile, and castigated other prominent ideas in music theory. So yeah, I think more people should know what Schenkerian analysis really is. But let's maybe have a healthy relationship to it this time.